This is the Building 7 episode, the forensic episode, the minimum viable conspiracy episode. And I want to lay this out clearly. No yelling, no sensationalism, no pre-cooked conclusions, because the strangest thing about Building 7 isn't that it fell, it's that the more you dig into it, the more every explanation feels incomplete. So let's start at ground level. Building 7 was a 47-story steel high-rise built in 1987. It wasn't part of the Twin Towers. It sat across the street on top of a Con Edison substation, already a weird structural constraint. The building had a unique load path that engineers later said made it more vulnerable to thermal expansion. Inside, this is where people start raising eyebrows. Building 7 housed a secret CIA station nobody knew existed until after 9/11, the largest Secret Service office outside of D.C., SEC offices holding thousands of active case files that went up in smoke, Department of Defense space, the Mayor's Emergency Operations Center, and nearly 20 floors of Salomon Brothers. So right off the bat, yes, it was a building full of sensitive agencies and secure operations. Does that automatically prove conspiracy? No, but it absolutely explains why the building's collapse became such a magnet for suspicion. So let's look at the timeline of the day. Here's the clean sequence. After the North Tower collapsed at 10:28 a.m., debris slammed into the south side of Building 7. It didn't carve a giant hole like conspiracy videos dramatize, but it did damage several floors and ignited fires on at least 10 of them. Water mains were severed, sprinklers died, no firefighting happened. By early afternoon, firefighters reported a bulge, a structural sway, on the southwest corner between floors 10 and 13. They heard creaking, groaning, shifting metal. Chief Daniel Negro made a call that ended up saving lives. He pulled everyone back, established a collapse zone, and told crews to get away from the building entirely. No one died. Not one firefighter. Not one civilian. That's the part of the story almost nobody brings up. So let's look at the official explanation and why people don't buy it. FEMA's first attempt to explain the collapse was rough. They straight up admitted their best hypothesis had a low probability of occurrence. That is an insane sentence to see in an official report about a national catastrophe. Then came NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, with the big formal final explanation in 2008. Their conclusion was fire, not weakened steel, but expanded steel. NIST said that long-span floor beams heated, expanded, and pushed a girder off its seat at column 79. That triggered a cascading failure inside the building, which then took down the entire core, which then took down the exterior. It sounds neat on paper, but here's where things get messy. NIST's computer simulation doesn't look like the actual collapse. Their model writhes and twists. The real building comes straight down, symmetrical, almost peaceful. Then there's the freefall issue. When early critics pointed out that Building 7 dropped in freefall for 2.25 seconds, meaning zero resistance, NIST denied it publicly on camera. Then, months later, they revised the report and admitted that yes, freefall happened. Their explanation was that the columns lost all capacity. So critics called BS on that. Buckled columns don't magically turn into air, and here's the biggest problem of all. NIST refuses to release the modeling data, won't hand it over, won't let anyone independently verify their collapse simulation. They cite a law that allows withholding information that might jeopardize public safety. How the failure model of a 24-year-old building endangers the public has never been convincingly explained. So, the official explanation has holes. Not fatal holes, but big enough to make reasonable people raise an eyebrow. So enter the University of Alaska Fairbanks study, a 4-year project led by Dr. Leroy Hulsey. They released all their data, hundreds of gigabytes, total transparency, and their conclusion was that fire could not have caused the collapse. Their models simply wouldn't produce the NIST scenario. To replicate the visible collapse, they had to remove support from every column almost simultaneously, which basically screams that something else did this. But that study also had its own issues. It was funded by a 9/11 activist group, never published in a mainstream engineering journal, and very critically, it doesn't explain how the columns failed. It just proves fire can't do it. Useful, yes, but conclusive, not even close. And this is where conspiracy people jump in. Freefall, symmetry, a building dropped onto its footprint. To them, it looks like a demolition. And visually, it kind of does, but the demolition hypothesis has its own mountain to climb. To demolish Building 7 covertly, someone would have needed weeks of access to the building. A building with CIA and Secret Service security. Fireproofing removed from the building. The columns stripped and prepped, charges planted everywhere, and no one sees, hears, or talks about it for 20 plus years. Also, no explosions were heard. NIST calculates that charges capable of taking out 7's steel would have produced a blast as loud as a jet engine, something you would hear from blocks away. There's no audio like that, none. So demolition explains the symmetry, but demands secrecy and logistics that are almost too big to ignore. So there are a few things that sit in the uncanny valley of not proof, but genuinely strange. The big one is that NIST won't release its data. Science requires replication, and they won't allow it. Barry Jennings' testimony is another one. He reported explosions inside Building 7 before the towers fell. Later, he seemed pressured to revise his timeline. He died days before the NIST report came out, with no public cause of death. Is that proof? No. Is it weird? Absolutely. The fire department of New York predicted the collapse with eerie accuracy. No steel high-rise had ever collapsed from fire, yet multiple firefighters were saying, yeah, 7's coming down. Were they just being cautious after losing 343 men that morning? So where does that leave us? Here's the truth. Neither explanation is fully satisfying. The official story says fire did something fire has almost never done. The official story requires trusting a model no one is allowed to see. The official story also still can't visually match the collapse on video. The demolition theory requires impossible logistics in the world's most secure building. It requires silence from dozens of people for 2 decades. And it also requires charges that no one heard. Neither side completely works. Building 7 lives in that uncomfortable zone where every answer introduces new questions. So here's my stance. You don't need a massive inside job to explain the problems in the NIST report. You don't need a demolition team sneaking past the CIA, and you don't need a Hollywood setup. The minimum viable conspiracy is this. The government's official engineering analysis was rushed, sloppy, and politically pressured, and rather than admit uncertainty or incompetence, the agencies simply buried the details and declared the case closed. It's the Chernobyl model, not evil, just bureaucratic self-protection. That version doesn't require explosives. It doesn't require 200 people staying quiet. It doesn't require omniscient puppet masters. It only requires government agencies doing what government agencies do, protect themselves. So what would settle the debate here? The crazy part is we could resolve 99% of the controversy overnight. All it would take is NIST releasing the modeling data, independent structural engineers reviewing both studies, a real peer-reviewed engineering paper, full transparency on the collapse simulations. If NIST is right, their own data will prove it. If Hulsey is right, his model will stand up to independent review. But until that happens, Building 7 remains an epistemological orphan, a structural failure with no universally accepted explanation, a Rorschach test where people see whatever reinforces their worldview. Not because the evidence points clearly to demolition, and not because the official story is airtight, but because the truth sits in the one place America hates most, a middle zone of uncertainty that no one in power wants to revisit.